Alexander watched the emptiness in front of him, sitting in the wheelchair that, 2 years ago, had become his sentence. The accident that would steal his movements had forced him to abandon the vibrant world he inhabited. Before, Alexander was a powerful man, known for his ability to command and his coolness in business. But now, he felt like a prisoner of himself, surrounded by silent and indifferent walls. His life seemed a shadow of what it was, and day after day, he saw himself sinking into a loneliness with no return. The family, in an attempt to revive him, decided to hire a caregiver. Alexander was initially vehemently opposed. "I hated the idea of depending on someone." However, with no options, he found himself face to face with Isabella, a young woman whose specific look seemed to penetrate his barriers. She was serene with a calm presence, but Alexander received her coldly, as if his withering gaze could drive her away for good. However, Isabella remains impassive, accepting the challenge that her presence there imposes on him. In the first few days, the silence between them was dense and piercing. Isabella did not pressure him. She carried out her tasks efficiently and patiently, as Alexander's hostility was not enough to disturb her. He observed her discreetly, without showing any emotion. Internally, she wondered what kept her there, bearing the weight of her bitterness. Isabella, in turn, realized that Alexander was hiding something beyond what any words or gestures could reveal. One afternoon, after a brief exchange of harsh words, Isabella, with unshakable calm, suggested that Alexander take some air in the garden. The idea infuriated him. He hated feeling helpless, like he needed encouragement to do something simple. But something about her defiant posture awakened a dormant curiosity in him. He accepted the invitation without understanding why, and Isabella accompanied him there, where the silence of the place seemed to amplify the noise of his pain. In the garden, Alexander observed the greenery around him, without really connecting with the beauty around him. Isabella, by his side, remained silent, allowing him to process that moment. He found himself remembering the days when he walked through similar gardens, full of energy and certainty. He felt a tightness in his chest, a mix of longing and anger. Isabella noticed the slight tremor in his hands and without saying anything, just remained there, making it clear that, even in his pain, he was not alone. The following days brought more moments in the garden, always silent, but less and less charged with tension. Isabella maintained a discreet but constant presence, and Alexander, no matter how much he resisted, realized that his life was slowly transforming. He was irritated with himself for noticing the effect that young woman was beginning to have on him. He tried at all costs to maintain his firm and indifferent posture, but inside him something was moving, like a spark of light that he had long thought extinguished. That night, as Isabella left him in his room, Alexander looked at his reflection in the mirror and felt different. He was still the same man, but something had changed. Something he couldn't define, but something he knew was important. She had broken a part of the barrier he had erected around his heart, and he didn't know whether to fear or accept this new sensation. The next morning, Alexander woke up with a strange feeling. Although his body was as still as ever, his mind seemed more awake, attentive to the subtle noises in the house. He heard light footsteps and recognized that they were Isabella's, who, punctually, approached to begin her routine. Alexander didn't want to admit it, but her presence made him feel alive in a way he hadn't experienced in a long time. However, he remained cold, not giving her the opportunity to notice any change. Isabella noticed Alexander's effort to keep his distance. Still, her commitment was to his well-being, and therefore, she faced the silences and coldness with determination. Deep inside, she also carried wounds that she preferred to keep buried. He knew that his presence there was not just a matter of work, but a chance to start over and rebuild a life that, at some point in the past, had been broken. His gaze seemed distant, but it hid a whirlwind of feelings that no one could ever guess. One autumn afternoon, while Isabella was changing the flowers in Alexander's room, he observed the precision and care with which she carried out the task. He wondered what motivated her to be so dedicated, especially for someone like him, who didn't make the job any easier. Then, almost without realizing it, he asked her why she chose to care for people. Isabella paused for a moment, as if the question had touched something deep, and calmly replied that everyone has a reason for being where they are. His voice was filled with a serenity that contrasted with the weight of his words. Alexander didn't insist, but he kept the phrase echoing in his mind. For the first time, he felt that perhaps there was something in Isabella that reflected the very pain he carried. Days later, Isabella subtly shared a small part of her story. She mentioned that she had lost someone important, someone who changed her life forever. It was a brief confession without details, but enough for Alexander to understand that she also knew the pain that accompanied each day. This unexpected sharing was the first real moment of empathy between them. Alexander, even at a loss for words, felt connected to Isabella in a way he never imagined possible. She wasn't just there out of obligation. There seemed to be something more, something that made her stay by his side despite his coldness. He tried to ignore this feeling, as he didn't want to get attached to anyone, fearing that the loss would be even more painful. But every day, it became more difficult to ignore her presence. On one of these days, Isabella suggested that they explore the garden in an area that Alexander did not yet know well. Despite his resistance, he ended up giving in, driven by curiosity. Her willingness to show small details of her life that he no longer noticed touched something deep inside him. During this walk, he allowed himself to smile briefly, something that Isabella noticed with a special sparkle in her eyes. She had managed, little by little, to break through the layers of bitterness that Alexander cultivated. Later, alone in his room, Alexander thought about the fragments of stories that Isabella revealed. She seemed like an enigma, someone with a story full of pain but with a heart strong enough to try to help others face their battles. The connection they were building made him question his own beliefs about life and people. When he closed his eyes that night, Alexander realized that Isabella was beginning to fill the empty spaces that he thought were impossible to fill. As the days went by, Alexander began to notice small changes in himself. The absolute emptiness in which he lived was invaded by moments that, although brief, brought a feeling of hope. Isabella continued her routine with patience and respect, but now there was a new lightness between them, something that not even he could explain. The silent connection they were forming seemed to grow, even if neither of them were willing to admit it. Isabella, in turn, continued to keep her own secrets closely guarded. Despite her desire to open up, she feared that the shadows of her past could compromise the relationship she was building with Alexander. She knew he was beginning to trust her, and any hasty revelation could destroy the fragile bond growing between them. Still, there were moments when her gaze betrayed the serenity she tried so hard to maintain. Alexander noticed these moments, but respected her silence, understanding that each one carried deep scars. One cold night, upon returning from the garden, Alexander felt especially touched by Isabella's dedication. He thought about thanking her, but awkwardly remained silent, preferring to maintain the reserved posture he had always cultivated. However, Isabella noticed the gesture and, with a discreet smile, responded to his silence with an understanding look. For her, the gratitude he didn't verbalize was clear in his eyes, and at that moment, she knew she was getting closer to his heart, even if he still tried to resist. At the end of that day, Alexander found himself reflecting on the transformation that Isabella had brought about. He felt vulnerable, because he knew he was starting to care more than he wanted to. Isabella was no longer just a caretaker. She was someone who made him want to live, an invisible force that encouraged him to defy the limits imposed by his own heart. The routine between Alexander and Isabella continued to flow with a new harmony, and, every day, their closeness became more palpable. The conversations were deeper, the silences more comfortable. Isabella's presence not only brightened Alexander's days, but also began to dispel the shadows that had long accompanied him. He didn't want to acknowledge it, but each laugh shared and each look exchanged became a bridge that united their solitudes. One cloudy day, Isabella suggested that Alexander try a new rehabilitation exercise. He hesitated, fearing the discomfort that always accompanied such attempts. However, a small boost of courage, awakened by the connection they cultivated, made him agree. As Isabella guided his movements, she encouraged him with words of encouragement, and Alexander felt something new blossom within him. A hope that had been dormant but now very much alive. During the session, Isabella approached him and told him that every little step counted. This simple phrase echoed in his mind, leading him to reflect on how his life was at a standstill. What once seemed impossible began to become a new perspective. He realized that the strength he needed didn't just come from his muscles, but also from his determination and the support Isabella offered him. With each movement, he felt more connected not only to his body, but also to the life he had left. At night, as Isabella prepared dinner, Alexander watched her, feeling an inexplicable warmth in his chest. He noticed the delicate way she cut the vegetables, as if each movement was a dance. This simple scene, which he would never have appreciated before, now touched him deeply. How much had he closed himself off from the beauty of everyday life? As he watched, he felt a growing desire to know more about who she was beyond being a caregiver. her dreams, her struggles, her story. With a sudden impulse, Alexander decided it was time to give back. He invited her to sit at the table during dinner. Isabella hesitated for a moment, but soon accepted the invitation, her smile lighting up the room. The meal, although simple, was full of meaning. Alexander struggled to ask questions, wanting her to feel comfortable sharing. The dialogue started timidly, but as the dishes were cleaned, the conversation flowed more easily, revealing small fragments of their lives. Isabella talked about her childhood in a small town, how she had dreamed of being a nurse and helping people. Every word carried passion, and Alexander found himself admiring the determination she exuded. At the same time, a small mystery surrounded his past. Isabella briefly mentioned an event that had changed her life, but then looked away, as if the weight of the memory was too much to bear. Alexander noticed, but decided not to press, respecting the space she still needed. At the end of the meal, as they talked, the connection between them intensified. It was as if they were stitching their wounds together, a delicate task that required patience and vulnerability. Alexander didn't realize when he started to really care about Isabella. The resistance that had always been an armor was falling apart, and he was beginning to open himself to the emotions he feared so much. The beauty of that night wasn't just in the food, but in the connection that formed between them. After Isabella said goodbye, Alexander sat alone, reflecting on how much his heart was beginning to warm again. He didn't know where this relationship would take them, but something inside him whispered that it was a path worth exploring. He was beginning to believe that even with all his limitations, there was still room for light in his life. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt ready to face it. In the days that followed, the relationship between Alexander and Isabella continued to blossom. The garden became her refuge, a place where conversation and laughter replaced the oppressive silence that previously dominated her days. Alexander was allowing himself to dream again, and this new perspective made every day feel more vibrant. However, in this new light, the shadow of Isabella's past began to become a more noticeable presence. There was a mystery surrounding her that he felt he needed to understand. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, Alexander decided it was time to confront the secrets that surrounded them. He knew there was something deep and painful in Isabella's story, and it worried him. He felt that, for their relationship to progress, they would need to open up to each other. With his heart racing, he invited her for a longer walk in the garden, hoping that the peaceful surroundings would make her feel comfortable sharing. As they walked, Isabella talked about flowers and plants, her passion evident in every word. But as soon as Alexander introduced the topic of his past, he saw the change in his expression. The sparkle in her eyes was gradually replaced by a distant, sad look. She hesitated, as if weighing each word. Alexander, sensing the tension, decided to give her space to choose what to share. I knew that trust was built over time, and I didn't want to force a revelation. Finally, after a few minutes of silence, Isabella took a deep breath and began to speak. She revealed that she had lost her younger brother in a tragic accident, something that had devastated her family and changed her life forever. The weight of her pain and the struggle she faced in dealing with the loss became palpable. The words came out with a mix of sadness and strength, as she spoke about the despair she felt and how it led her to become a carer. The desire to help others was a way to redeem oneself from pain, to find purpose in the midst of chaos. Alexander listened silently, absorbing every word. He had no idea what to say. The stories of pain and loss touched him deeply, making him realize that despite his own struggle, he had been selfish in his suffering. Isabella's past was a burden she carried with dignity, and the strength she demonstrated was a light that illuminated not only her life, but his as well. He wanted to offer comfort, but he didn't know how to do that without seeming condescending. After the outburst, a comforting silence took over the environment. Alexander, still in a state of reflection, realized that each of them struggled with their own shadows, and, through this exchange, an unbreakable bond began to form. They were two survivors who found each other in the midst of their respective storms. Their shared vulnerability, far from driving them apart, brought them closer together in a way he never imagined possible. Over time, Alexander realized that Isabella was not just a caregiver, but someone who had chosen to be by his side in a time of fragility. It was a gesture of love that went beyond what words could express. As they walked, he decided it was time to share his own story. Not to compete with her pain, but to show that he was human too. With the courage he had found in his connection with Isabella, he began to tell about the accident that changed his life and the loneliness that followed. The tears in Isabella's eyes as he spoke were a reflection of the empathy she felt. From that moment on, they both knew they were not alone in their battles. The vulnerability had become a bridge, and as they spoke, their wounds began to heal a little. At the end of the day, the sun began to set, and Alexander looked at Isabella, realizing that by sharing their stories, they had built a stronger foundation, based on understanding and love. Their journey was just beginning, but together they were ready to take it on. In the days following the emotional exchange of confidences, Alexander and Isabella experienced a new dynamic in their relationship. The vulnerability they shared had turned into a strength, and the friendship that had formed between them was deeper and more meaningful. The feeling of loneliness that had always accompanied Alexander began to dissipate. He discovered that Isabella's presence was not just a momentary relief, but a constant support that offered him security and warmth. It was a new kind of love, a love born of understanding, empathy, and mutual strength. Isabella also realized that by opening up to Alexander, she had found a safe space to explore her own emotions. Days in the garden became more than just work. They were moments of discovery and healing. Alexander began to put more effort into his rehabilitation, determined to make good on the opportunity Isabella offered him. He felt motivated not just by his own strength, but by the need not to disappoint her. With each small progress, a smile lit up his face, and Isabella, seeing him triumph, felt that every effort was worth it. One afternoon, Isabella decided it was time to take Alexander for a walk outside the garden, something they had both been dreaming about. They planned to visit a small cafe on the corner of the street, a place where the aroma of fresh coffee and people's laughter blended into a welcoming atmosphere. Alexander was nervous, but the idea of going out and experiencing the world again excited him. It was a sign that his life was moving forward, and not just in a cycle of rehabilitation. The cafe was decorated with flowers and soft lights, creating an intimate and inviting atmosphere. When they entered, some people's curious looks were directed at them, but Isabella held Alexander's hand, comforting him. He realized that her presence made everything easier. After ordering, they sat at a table near the window. The view of the city, with its lights and movement, made Alexander feel a relief and joy that he hadn't experienced in a long time. While they waited for the proposal, Isabella started talking about her dreams, her desire to travel and explore the world. He listened intently, admiring the passion in her voice. With each story she told, he felt more connected to her. In turn, Isabella encouraged him to share his own dreams, and Alexander reluctantly finally began to talk about the life he would like to have. A life where he would not be defined by his wheelchair, but by his achievements and experiences. However, the moment of happiness was interrupted when a group of people entered the cafe, and Alexander recognized one of his old co-workers. The man, who hadn't seen him in years, seemed surprised to see him there. In an instant, the expression of empathy turned to embarrassment, and the happiness of the moment evaporated. The colleague approached, but the look of pity and the way he talked about the past made Alexander feel small and vulnerable. He knew he was still seen as the victim of the accident, not the man who was fighting to get back on his feet. Isabella noticed the change in the environment and immediately placed her hand on Alexander's, offering him support. The gesture of affection made him feel less exposed. After a few words, the colleague said goodbye, and the conversation soon turned to other topics. Alexander, however, was deep in thought, struggling not to let the man's presence ruin the day. Isabella, always attentive, encouraged him to talk about what he was feeling. "It was difficult, you know," Alexander said, frustration evident in his voice. "I still see myself as the person who lost everything, not who I'm becoming." Isabella listened to him attentively, allowing his words to flow. He didn't want to be the person defined by his past, but every time someone looked at him with pity, that definition came back to tighten around him like a shackle. She encouraged him to see himself as a fighter, not a loser. The conversation made him realize that although there were obstacles, he had someone by his side who saw his strength. Isabella was there to remind him that, despite what others thought, he had the power to rewrite his own narrative. So, with renewed determination, Alexander decided he wouldn't let the looks of others shape who he was. He was becoming more than a victim. He was becoming a man in search of his future. At the end of the tour, as they returned home, Alexander smiled at Isabella. She wasn't just his caretaker. "I was your partner on this journey." He felt grateful to have her by his side. The two began to dream together, envisioning a future where they could build a fulfilling life, full of love and discovery. Their connection was a strength that transcended their pain and fears, creating a new path, one that led them to a destiny they both deserved. The days passed like leaves blown by the wind, and Alexander and Isabella's routine settled into a comforting rhythm. The garden continued to be the stage for their deep conversations and shared smiles, but the expectation of something greater was in the air. Their friendship was turning into something more, something they both felt but were hesitant to name. Alexander, in turn, struggled with the confusion of emotions that invaded him. The connection they cultivated was intense, but he didn't know if he was ready to take a step towards a love that seemed so far away. One night, as they watched the stars twinkling above, Isabella, as always, managed to penetrate Alexander's defenses with her innate curiosity. "Have you ever thought about what you would do if you could walk again?" she asked, looking deeply into his eyes. The question took Alexander by surprise. He hesitated, reflecting on the many paths his life could have taken. "It would be easy to say that I want to go back to the way things were," he began, "but now I don't know. Part of me feels grateful to have found you in the middle of all this." The words were like a sharp blade, cutting through the soft atmosphere of the night. Isabella blushed, but soon realized the depth of what he said. "I feel that way too, Alexander. Your fight inspires me to keep going, even when everything seems impossible." The atmosphere between them was charged with emotion, and the sincerity in the voices that crossed formed an even stronger bond. But in the back of his mind, a familiar echo began to resonate. Fear. The fear of losing everything, of not being enough. Alexander knew that if he allowed himself to love Isabella, he might be faced with new pain if things didn't work out. He decided to change the subject, avoiding what could become an even more intense conversation. "Have you ever thought about your own ambitions? What are your dreams for the future?" he asked, trying to bring lightness to the moment. Isabella smiled, but her expression quickly turned serious. "My dreams are complicated. After what happened to my brother, I just focused on helping others. But deep down, I still want to be a nurse and work in hospitals. Helping those who are suffering like I did before, it's what really makes me happy." Her words echoed through Alexander like a familiar melody, a resonance he never expected. He admired her passion and determination, but at the same time, an uneasiness began to grow within him. However, the serene atmosphere was abruptly interrupted when a sudden phone call cut through the night. Isabella answered, and the expression on her face immediately changed. She looked at Alexander with a mixture of concern and panic. "It's my father," she said, her voice shaking. "He's in the hospital. It looks like he was in an accident." The news hit them like a bucket of cold water. Alexander felt his heart tighten, and the sudden gravity of the situation made him feel helpless. "You need to go there," he said, trying to hide the anxiety that was building in his chest. Isabella nodded, but her expression was distant, as if her mind was far away. "I will, but what about you? Will you be okay here?" she asked, her concern mixing with the urgency of the situation. "I'll be fine," Alexander replied, even though he wasn't sure if he truly believed his own statement. He wanted Isabella to go, to be by her family's side at this crucial moment. With one last look, she left, and Alexander felt strangely lonely. The garden now felt empty without Isabella's vibrant energy. He struggled with feelings of helplessness, questioning whether he could truly help her, whether he could be a strong presence during this crisis. As the hours dragged by, anxiety became a constant companion. Alexander thought about the fragility of life and how, in an instant, everything could change. He began to remember the moments they spent together, the conversations and laughs, and how essential Isabella had become in his life. The thought that she could be facing tragedy made her heart heavy. He decided that as soon as he heard back, he would do his best to be there for her, offering support. Finally, as the sun began to rise, Isabella returned. Her eyes were swollen, and Alexander realized she had been crying. He immediately stood up, worried. "What happened? Is everything okay with your father?" he asked, his tone brimming with concern. Isabella took a deep breath before speaking, as if she was weighing each word. "He got hurt, but he's going to be okay. He was lucky. But I got a call from the hospital that changed everything." Confusion gripped Alexander. "What do you mean?" he asked, noticing that Isabella was hesitant. With a steady gaze, she continued, "I found out that my brother didn't die in an accident. He was murdered." The revelation was a devastating blow. The weight of the words hung between them, and Alexander felt the deep pain emanating from Isabella. She was not only dealing with loss, but also an unfolding mystery in a field of unsolved tragedies. I don't know how to deal with this. My father always hid the truth, Isabella said, her voice breaking. Alexander, stunned, grabbed her hand, feeling the intensity of the moment. He knew that the revelation would alter not only Isabella's story, but also what was between them. What might seem like a romance was turning into a battle against ghosts from the past, and both were about to face a storm that could redefine their lives. The air was thick with the revelation Isabella had just shared. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the depth of the situation. What do you mean, murdered? What do you know about this? He asked, the urgency in his voice reflecting the gravity of the moment. Isabella took a deep breath, trying to collect the confusing thoughts in her mind. Actually, I don't know much. The call I received was from a detective who is investigating the case. He said there is evidence that has not been disclosed, and my father hid the truth from all of us. Alexander held Isabella's hand firmly, understanding that she was about to be plunged into a maze of pain and uncertainty. You don't have to face this alone. We are in this together, he said, determined to support Isabella on the journey ahead. Deep down, however, he also felt terrified. What had begun as a love story was now tangled up in a dark and complex mystery. The need to uncover the truth became imperative, not just for Isabella, but for both of them. The next morning, they met with the detective at the cafe where it all started. The man, robust and with a serious look, soon exposed the evidence he had found. Apparently, your brother was involved in something much bigger than you imagined. He had connections with dangerous people, explained the detective, analyzing Isabella and Alexander's reactions. Isabella's mind was agitated, and a mixture of anger and confusion took over her. But my brother was a good man. How could he get involved with people like that? Alexander knew it was time to act. We need to find out the truth. If he was in danger, we need to understand what happened and why, he said, feeling an impulse to protect Isabella, like never before. They committed to investigating further, but at the same time, the fear of what they might find consumed them. Their search for the truth led them to an old friend of their brother, someone who had moved away after his death. He was a nervous man, with deep circles under his eyes and a look that betrayed a troubled past. If you want to know the truth, you need to prepare yourself. His brother was about to expose a network of corruption. He had evidence that could bring down very powerful people, he revealed, with a trembling voice. Isabella felt the weight of the words and the despair in her chest increased. Alexander realized that the revelation carried with it not only potential danger, but also the need to protect Isabella at all costs. What should have been a search for answers soon turned into a race against time. With each step, the feeling that they were being watched increased. They began to move cautiously, but fear did not stop them. In fact, the connection between them deepened, and the trust they cultivated was a ray of light amidst the darkness. As the investigation continued, Alexander and Isabella began to discover that her father played a central role in the story. Not only did he know about his son's activities, but he also seemed to be involved in some way. My father couldn't have done that, Isabella said, anguished. He loved my brother. However, Alexander realized that things were not always what they seemed. What could have been a protective love could also hide dark secrets. That night, as they were reviewing the information, Isabella received an anonymous message. Be careful with your father. He's not who you think he is. Fear enveloped her like a heavy cloak. What does this mean? She whispered, her voice cracking. Alexander, concerned for her safety, decided they needed to confront Isabella's father before it was too late. We will find him and demand answers. We cannot allow him to manipulate us any longer. The tension was at its peak when they headed to Isabella's house. The father was visibly nervous, and his shifty gaze raised all the red flags. What are you doing here? He asked, with a defensive tone of voice. Isabella, determined, looked her father in the eyes and demanded to know the truth. The man hesitated, but the pressure was great. You don't know what you're doing. Sometimes silence is the best response, he said, trying to avoid confrontation. But the mood quickly changed when Isabella revealed the message she had received. The father turned pale, and in an instant, control began to slip away. You don't know what you're talking about. His brother was in something much deeper. He was putting his family in danger. The revelation made Isabella hesitate. What do you mean by that? The father, cornered, hesitated, but there was no longer any way to escape. That was when an abrupt noise erupted from the next room. The door opened, and hooded men entered, armed and with threatening expressions. Alexander grabbed Isabella's hand, pulling her back, prepared to protect. "You guys should have stayed away," one of the men said in a hoarse voice. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. This was not a coincidence. They were being followed. In the midst of the confusion, Isabella's father finally gave himself up. "They won't stop until you know the truth. The truth about your brother. And the truth about me." His words cut like a knife. Alexander, sensing the urgency of the situation, shouted, "Run away. I will hold them." He turned to face the intruders, determined to protect Isabella at any cost. Chaos ensued. Isabella, between tears and panic, saw her father being dragged out of the house by the men, but she could do nothing. Her heart racing, she felt like she was losing everything. The love, the truth, and the protection that Alexander had always represented. However, amidst the confusion, something inside him began to change. Determined not to be a victim, Isabella followed Alexander, running out the back door. Love and courage pulsed in her heart, and she realized she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. She was no longer just the sister of a murdered man, but a woman determined to uncover the truth and free herself from the shadows that surrounded her life. The night became a maze of emotions and confrontations. While Alexander fought the men, Isabella sought refuge in her resolve. And it was at that moment that the most surprising truth of all revealed itself. Isabella, her mind racing, remembered a necklace that her brother always wore. A necklace with a symbol that belonged to an ancient secret society. A society that her father had sworn to protect. He wasn't just fighting. He was part of something you didn't know about. Isabella screamed, and confusion reigned. The father, caught between fear and loyalty, finally turned to Isabella and said, "You don't understand. They will stop at nothing, and you are at the center of it all now. It's time for you to know who we really are." What should have been a moment of terror quickly became a turning point. Isabella didn't know that she was about to discover that her family's history was full of dark secrets, that her father and brother were not the only victims, but that there was a much bigger story, a plot that linked them to a legacy of power and betrayal. However, as they tried to escape, Alexander realized he was in a vulnerable position. One of the hooded men pushed him and he fell, but not before holding Isabella's hand tightly. "Go. Discover the truth. I will find you no matter what." The words echoed in Isabella's mind as she fled, determined to discover the truth about her brother, her father, and the legacy they were hiding. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. The fight was just beginning, and the connection with Alexander would become her beacon in the darkness. With her heart racing, Isabella walked away, adrenaline pumping through her veins, and the promise of a love that would overcome all adversity guided her towards freedom. It was time to face the truth, time to fight for love and justice. And so, Isabella and Alexander's journey turned into a search not just for answers, but for freedom from a dark past that threatened to consume them. The end of the path was approaching, but the true beginning was just beginning. The revelation of what lurked in the shadows was about to be revealed, and Isabella would become more than a survivor. She would become the hero of her own story. And you, what would you do if you were in Isabella's place? The fight for justice and the search for truth can be more dangerous than we imagine. Don't let fear control your life. Share your opinion in the comments and follow us for more stories that touch the heart and challenge the mind. Together, we can unravel the mysteries surrounding love and loyalty.